let's say you've been doing it for 10 years. You need a long version around, sure, you're going to make sure that, the customer support is the best that it could be, but you're going to miss out on growing the business 400% because you're not expanding. You're doing things that other people could do instead of the only things you could do. You're not expanding into new markets, into new geos. You're not adding new products. So that time is not being spent then on all of the other expansion mechanisms that should be getting pulled into.
I'm your host, Nick McLean, and this is Ambition. In the last couple of decades, we've been likening a startup's successful trajectory to space travel as the company takes off like a proverbial rocket ship. What startup pops into your head when you hear that expression? Maybe Meta about 20 years ago? Where are you on the journey? How long before your rocket ship enters hyperspace? Consider this. There may be a hack for getting there. Not focusing on the sole technology, but broadening your company's capabilities, sometimes even reinventing how it works through mergers and acquisitions, also known as M&A. And because I'm a big fan of M&A myself, I'm psyched to introduce our guest for this episode, Zack Dugow. He's the founder and CEO of the ad tech firm The Cool Company, which, through its acquisitions, has been able to provide a better online experience for users, publishers, franchisees, and advertisers. Today, The Cool Company is considered one of the fastest growing companies in North America, and its platforms reach over 2 billion consumers every year. Zack Dugow's story began with his own startup called Insticator, which gamified user predictions of TV show outcomes. Insticator later included embeddable polls and trivia, which increased engagement, data collection, and monetization for publishers. Since then, its successor, The Cool Company, has grown through numerous acquisitions of enterprises in the ad tech and martech spaces, which have broadened its capabilities. As Zack likes to say as he recounts his entrepreneurial journey, when it comes to growing, companies don't always do what they originally intended. Here is how he has been able to grow his company to where it is today. Hi, everyone. Nick McLean here with Ambition. Really excited about the show today. We have Zack Dugow with Cool Company here to tell his story about all the amazing ad tech, martech companies that he's formed. And I'm sure there's a few others that are completely unrelated given how entrepreneurial Zack seems. But before we get into that, Zack, I'm just going to put you on the spot. Why should we as listeners really care about your story? What have you done that is unique in this world where, we're always hearing about these new technologies and whatnot? What about your company or companies is unique?
Well, I think with no background in the ad tech, martech space, I was able to build an 8-figure revenue and growing almost 9-figure company in revenue and more than that in value. And through great determination, as well as being an opportunist as it relates to opportunities through growth, opportunities for growth through acquisition. So we've acquired 5 other companies in our industry and integrated them. And that wasn't, initially part of our plan. We had pivoted into each of these different verticals. So, our story started out here and through lots of curves and twists and entanglements and otherwise, and exciting changes ended up here. So I think that's a pretty compelling, exciting story because lots of businesses and industries have dynamic changes. And I think the teams that win are the ones that can move fast enough to take advantage of those changes.
I love it. I think that's a great segue to talk about Cool Company and all the different components, how it got started. And probably not every one of those twists and turns you went on, but maybe a few of the more meaningful twists and turns along the journey.
Sure. So we got started about 12 years ago. The initial company name was Insticator, which is now just a subsidiary of the Cool Company. And the initial idea for Insticator came about because I was watching Mad Men with a bunch of my friends, and I was predicting what would happen in the show. And we had real community around that predicting element. So the initial idea for Insticator was that people could predict outcomes of TV shows and sporting events to win points for rewards and like a gamified experience. And we launched with that and had some success with that, but then found that, getting to around 50,000 users, that in order to really scale the business and turn it into a business, we needed to go to where these fans were. So we pivoted the technology into what is now present day's Instigator's content engagement units and pivoted that experience to be embeddable into different websites where we had trivia and polling and predictions and all different types of engaging parts of the experience, and found we could drive increases in engagement for publishers, data collection, and then ultimately also monetization for them as well. So that's how Instigator was really born. And then through that growth, one site became 10 sites we partnered with, became 50, became 500, and so on. And that then led us on our journey of acquiring other companies to grow and scale more. So we acquired a commenting company at first in Squawk It so that we could have even bigger experiences and collect even more email addresses for our publishers and customers. And then we acquired OKO Digital because we wanted to build off of our initial platform advertising tech and build something stronger on the SSP side. Now we have an SSP that we offer for display video and CTV ads. And then we looked at it, we said, well, now in order for this side of our business to be successful, we really need direct brand relationships and agency relationships. And that then fed into other companies that we acquired, including Ballyhoo, where we do franchise marketing differently, where we localize search, social, display video, and CTV ads based on store location for big global brands like Luxottica and Kohler and many others. And from Ballyhoo, we then acquired a company called Comedia, where we do attribution and managed service media buying for big agencies and independent agencies all around the globe. And then that moved us into acquiring our most recent acquisition about 6 months ago, Parisian-based company called Adventory, where we do dynamic creative optimization. And so all of our mission at the Cool Company is to build a better experience for publishers, users, advertisers, agencies, and franchisees. And each of our companies that we've acquired really feed off of each other. They drive synergies and value through cross-sell or the media spend from our advertiser units like Ballyhoo and Advertiser and Cool Media feed into our publisher base of publishers that we work with on the Instigator side of our business. And then the data we collect on the Instigator and OKO side of our business feeds into data that's used then for our advertisers that we work with. And so each of our acquisitions have helped the parent company and each of the other subsidiaries, or we wouldn't have done them and have a path to do so. So that's kind of our interesting origin story. And what I'll tell you is that, Nick, I think is interesting about it is that was never our game plan. Our game plan was such a 180 and not dissimilar from a lot of tech companies. And what I was saying earlier, the teams that win are the ones that pivot. You know, YouTube was video dating. Flickr was a role-playing strategy game. For us, so different from where we ended up today. And so that just consistent listening to the marketplace, listening to feedback, adjusting and pivoting is, I think, what's helped us be successful.
It's really interesting. As a private equity founder, we definitely employ growth via M&A in a lot of circumstances. And also we encounter a lot of business owners that have customer concentration. You probably aren't aware of this, but one of the biggest deal killers out there is customer concentration. And my first advice to business owners, if there is customer concentration, is to pursue growth by acquisition in order to make some of those numbers smaller. Was growing by M&A, was it a difficult decision for you, or whenever you started to think about it as part of your strategy, it just clicked and you thought, this is definitely the right next step for us? Yes, it's scary or risky or whatever adjective you want to use there. But can you just talk to me a little bit about the thought process? Because I think a lot of business owners have also thought about pursuing M&A, but maybe haven't, or maybe have gone about it differently than you have.
Sure. So we certainly weighed a lot of risks against growing vis-a-vis M&A in the beginning. And one of the things that helped us on that path was that we had our supply side business in Instigator and thought, okay, great. Why don't we grow instead of just programmatically? Why don't we grow the direct sales side of that business? And we tried to do that little pieces one by one and really failed at that. And then thought, wow, speaking to other companies in the space, the companies that nailed that had customers for many years, had a whole different product that they'd hooked in, a SaaS product or a media product for different brands or agencies, and the huge sales teams and sales forces, and really entrenched themselves. And it was like, well, we could bang our heads against a wall and maybe not be successful, this key part of our business, trying to grow that sales team organically on the direct media side, or we can acquire a team that's doing it successfully, can bring a whole new product into our fold, and that we can then, learn from their team, cross-sell, integrate. So weighing the risks, which are, culture impact and could this fall apart? And there's a lot of risks there. But for us, weighing the upside, I think we were really fortunate that we were able to acquire companies that wanted to grow together, wanted the opportunity to bring, 2 plus 2 together to equal 7. And that's what we've seen. We've seen the ability to really cross-sell products effectively, integrate teams, because you bring a whole new perspective that you didn't think about when you bring new people into the room. It's like physics. You enter in a third variable, a fourth variable, a fifth variable, and now everything's totally different. So I would say if you have a business that is and I think this is, almost never the case, but it does exist. So it's worth saying, if you have a business that's growing 400% a year, your team is firing on all cylinders, and, nothing's stopping you guys, then I would say, taking the time and the effort and all of those other things to do M&A as another variable probably doesn't make sense. But if you have a strong business and you're growing, but there's places where you guys aren't as strong or it's not your expertise and you need some help and support, I really recommend it. It's really played out very well for us. And so I think oftentimes what I've seen from founders and CEOs is they spend a lot of time on the risks, which are very real, but it's hard for them to properly evaluate the upside. Like, as an example, just like in hiring with people, you can kind of understand or estimate what is the impact to your business or this team if you take a C player and you get them to level up to being a B. But you can't predict what happens if you didn't have the C player and instead now you have an A player there. So that's sort of how we've approached it. And I think we've been really fortunate that we've been able to work with some fantastic teams.
I think it's really interesting what you said, because I have worked in corporate development for large companies. And what I would tell you about the process there is that, at least from my personal opinion, is that they tend to overestimate the synergies from the acquisition, and therefore sometimes, not all the time obviously, but sometimes will overpay up front because of the expected synergies. And again, I love growing by M&A. I think I'll always be a proponent of it. So I don't want to come across as me saying that I disagree with it. But again, I think it's interesting to think about the other perspective of buyers that might overestimate the synergies and therefore overpay. How did you think about synergies whenever you were evaluating the opportunities, or was it less about synergies and more just about strategic fit? Could you talk about that a little bit for me? Sure.
We never did valuation based off of the synergies and the combined company. So we always wanted to see that as quote unquote, like upside and gravy. So meaning we were never like, all right, if we do this, then it's going to add this amount of combined synergy, revenue, so on and so forth. We were always valuing the business as a standalone. So we were never looking at it and going, well, because you may not get that. And you're absolutely right. You may not get those cost synergies. You may not get those revenue synergies. So I'm a fan of M&A. I'm not a fan of doing valuation based off of the synergies that you think you'll get, because I don't think that will ever exist. And you have to be prepared for the deals to not happen because of valuation. So for the 5 companies we've acquired, there's probably 4, there's a tremendous number that we didn't go forward with because either it wasn't the right fit, or in a lot of cases it could have been a good fit, but we couldn't get there in price. And some of the times that was because, well, look at what we could do combined. It's like, yes, but we don't know we'll actually get that. So you have to be prepared to walk away. I think that's important. And I think you got to be very diligent in how you're valuing the acquired target. And so when you're looking at that risk capital and that risk calculation, I don't think it makes sense, to your point. I think a lot of people bake that in, and that's, I think there's a great saying. It's like, you make your money when you buy, not when you sell. And I definitely think that's true in M&A for companies. You make your money buying on the downside case, not in the selling but you win by getting all of the upside that you didn't predict.
I say it slightly differently. I say you make your money on the way in, but same exact message.
Yes.
One thing that's also that I'd also like to spend some time on is I come across business owners that have done a really good job of getting the business to a certain size. And once it gets to that size, my perception is that they continue to do the same types of tasks. They don't start delegating more, or they don't start focusing on strategic issues. And because of that, it actually strangles the company to a certain degree, and either growth stops or at least it slows and goes much lower than it could be. Thinking about your own story, have your roles and responsibilities changed a great deal over time? Has that been a struggle for you to think about when you need to let go of some control so that you can focus on the big picture issues and make sure that the company continues to grow at the pace that it's capable of?
Absolutely. I think your job as CEO is to try to keep evolving your responsibility set for where the business is. And that's a lot easier said than done. It's safe. It feels safe to dive into the tasks that you know how to do and know how to do well, and the areas of the business to focus on because you know those areas of the business well and you know those parts of the business well. Like as an example, early days of the company, I was on like every customer email, every account detail, every so on and so forth. And now I have, GMs and CEOs of each of our business units, and it's really about empowering them to be successful and helping them achieve success. Still at times, the team can be like, hey, can you help on this one specific thing? Or, someone or whatever that is. And that's never going to go away. But I would say if your company's firing on all cylinders, and that shouldn't be the case. And what I would suggest is if you find yourself in a scenario where you are consistently being pulled back into something that's, call it like more tactical, that you shouldn't be spending your time on consistently, and you're just like, God, I just don't trust it. I think you need to evaluate, do I have the right team in place? Because your gut may be telling you, pulling you in there because it's just something you used to do a lot and you need to break out of yourself. Or is it because when you stepped away, it broke? And if it broke each time you stepped away, do I have the right leader in place there? Because maybe if you do have the right leader in place there, then you're going to feel a lot more comfortable to not be so involved in the day-to-day. Of course, business has to be able to afford it and so on and so forth. But I think that's a good question that founders should ask themselves. Do I have the right leaders in place? And if you do, I think you'll find that you can have a lot more comfort in stepping away from the more tactical or mid-level or what have you. And it's often a symptom when I find myself not doing that. I'm like, wow, do I have the right team in place? If not, what do I need to level up and change and plan on leveling up so that we're setting ourselves up for success?
So given the M&A, did that give you a good opportunity to test out having a GM or a president of a business unit so that it was a natural way for you not to get involved because there was somebody else there and you're able to use that experience in further other situations? Or can you just talk to me about that? And apologies, just the context there, though, is because a lot of business owners I've talked to are very fearful about bringing somebody in to run the business because they think nobody can do it as well as them, or it's just nervous and risky. So if you can maybe think about it in that context, if you could.
Yeah, for sure. So that is exactly what happened. We kept the teams in place from the companies that we acquired in most cases, in 80% of the cases. And that allowed us to have a CEO or GM in place. And it was really my correspondence is mainly with that individual, except for at all hands in terms of the way they're running the business. And it can show you can have someone who's going to run that unit well. And if you can develop a strong relationship there, they tell you what they need. You guys have good communication, future looking. It's very positive. It also can help you level up a lot as a leader to be managing individuals who just kind of own their P&L and outcomes like soup to nuts. And I think that, your question is a really, really valid one, and it's a tough one I've seen a lot of people struggle with. One of the things I'll say is that when you can see somebody else run that business well, you can then be like, all right, great, I want this for all the other parts of the business. I want this for all the other parts in the business. To your question around okay, well, nobody's going to do it as well as me. That's probably true. But what happens is you need to take a longer term view around, whether it's true or not, but let's say you've been doing it for 10 years. You need a longer version around, sure, you're going to make sure that, the customer support is the best that it could be, but you're going to miss out on growing the business 400% because you're not expanding. You're doing things that other people could do instead of the only things you could do. You're not expanding into new markets, into new geos. You're not adding new products. So that time is not being spent then on all of the other expansion mechanisms that should be getting pulled into.
Switching gears, what excites you about what you do? Are you the type of person that just the growth of the business is what really gets you excited? Is it the finding solutions for these unique problems that your customers have and becoming indispensable to them? Can you just talk to me a little bit about what motivates you?
I like a few different things. One is I like that every year my role changes so much as a CEO. We have people now. So think of it like this, like 7 years ago, we had our team in New York, and now we have people and team in Australia, the UK, France, India, Ukraine, Canada. We have people all different walks, all different geos. And I find that very interesting with different products. I will tell you what excites me. And because if you can get over the hurdle and the fear around, okay, could that kill my company? I do think it's exciting when you get very large technical innovations or big changes in landscape, because I think what happens is you go into that cycle, and our business has gone through many cycles, but you go into that cycle and you realize that even if it's not going to, as long as it doesn't kill you, it can make your business so much stronger. And you can innovate and change things so much stronger that can bring you to a whole new level of growth. Taking something like AI, which in some ways could hurt some big parts of our business, in some ways could dramatically help a lot of parts of our business. And so if you get over that fear, it's exciting because that next cycle, whatever that next cycle is, as long as you make sure it doesn't kill you, it's going to help you really level up and think diligently about, do we have the right process in place? Do we have the right mentality in place, the right culture, the right people? Am I pushing things in the right direction? I think that ongoing evolution is really interesting because I think it's how, certainly for our business and our industry, it changes so frequently. I think it keeps things very exciting and dynamic.
You mentioned evolution a couple of times, and I think it might make sense to dive back to your strategy. Sometimes I hear people talk about a pivot to their strategy, and what I think is, normally I think, it's what you had to do. However, that can make the strategic planning process very difficult because you thought you were going down path ABC and now it's A, X, T, U, whatever that path might be. So how do you think about strategic planning in the context of there needs to be some level of effort, if you will, to stay the course, because you can't just be 31 flavors where you're changing your strategy every day. On the flip side, though, not being wedded to the strategy just because that's the strategy you had at the beginning of the year. Has that been a challenge for you, or has it just been so obvious that you need to change your strategy that it just wasn't even a second thought?
No, that's always been a challenge for us. In fact, so much so that we changed a lot of our planning processes. So we used to have an EOS system, which was you'd have these quarterly rocks, and then you would plan and you'd kind of give people tasks based on those goals, then rocks that would be at the company level, and they would break down to teams. And then we looked at OKRs. And what we found for us specifically is things would shift and move pretty consistently, that by the time the end of the quarter came, it was why did we do half of those things and we had to do the whole other half? Were those valid reasons? And it was often yeah, it was because we had to, because Google decided they were getting rid of cookies and they gave us a deadline, and then they changed that. And then they said, no, they're not getting rid of cookies. And then this changed and that changed, and all of these things that we had to adjust on the fly, and it threw off our annual plan and so on and so forth. So what I'm a big fan of is annual goals with monthly recalibrations, because monthly seems like it's enough to make good progress and at the same time still reevaluate. I envy industries that you can make a plan for a year and it's going to work. We know people want healthier cereal and there's no big changes. I don't know what that industry is, but I envy that industry because we are the opposite of that. Things shift and change so frequently. So I think for us at least, it's, the idea around annual goals and targets, and then you're kind of revisiting them monthly. Is that the right way of doing it? I think it probably is different for what the right way is for each business and industry. But I think for us, that's kind of what we've ended up moving towards.
And so, of course, you don't ask these exact questions, but the types of questions you might ask yourself at that monthly check-in what has changed since our last check-in that might warrant a bigger change to our strategy? Or what are the reasons? Like what are the reasons that we might want to change this? What are the reasons that we might want to keep it the same? Are those the types of questions maybe that you would ask yourselves and your team in order to determine how big of a shift to your annual strategy you might need?
That's exactly right. And is this still relevant? Do we have the resources to achieve this? Is there something new here that needs to now be up on the board as a goal or an OKR or whatever system you're using, because there's just some new variable that we didn't think about or wasn't relevant 2 months ago? So that's exactly right. It's kind of going through and looking at the parent level and making those adjustments. And that's why I think monthly is a great way of doing it. If you're super early stage, maybe you do it even differently. But because whatever you think about from an annual standpoint, if you're super early stage, is going to be so far out and different. But I think what you've said is pretty accurate.
I'd like to spend a little bit of time on culture. I feel like for many rapid growth companies, the culture can be either something that helps you sustain all the challenges encountered when there's hypergrowth. However, in your situation, yes, you achieved hypergrowth and maybe there was a culture, but you also had all these acquisitions that you had to integrate, which, as you mentioned, has an impact on culture. Could you talk to me a little bit about the company's culture and how you've tried to maintain that throughout the growth and all the acquisitions?
Definitely. So before we were acquiring companies, we would look at and try to measure people against our core values and go, okay, what are our core values? What are these core behaviors? For us, it was be defiantly great, sleeves up, and 100% viewability. It was get your hands dirty. We look for people to do that. We look for people who can be honest and real during tough conversations. And we look for people who are curious and finally great, and all the breakouts and machinations of that. When you're acquiring other companies, you want to make sure that your values are aligned, but they're never going to be 100% aligned, right? You want to make sure they're not 10% aligned, but maybe they're 60 or 70% aligned, which means there's 30% where maybe they're not aligned. And so understanding what those differences are, and maybe from a important standpoint, how are decisions made at this company, what values are, really rewarded, what are the unspoken values in this organization, as a part of your diligence process to make sure you're bringing something in that's going to be a good fit, I think is certainly key. But then knowing that your own values for your organization, whether you like it or not, are going to adjust. Most likely, it's not going to be as clean and simple because you're bringing in a whole different organization with a different set of values. And so your values really kind of should adjust. Hopefully they don't adjust, a 180, but maybe they adjust 10 or 20% because, hey, that company was doing these things great. And actually this value kind of makes sense and we could find a common ground. And then here's some things they can take from us and so on. So it's not cut and dry. It isn't simple, but, for us, it's been worth it to bring in values. I think spending the time upfront, very rarely do people do good enough job on culture diligence. I feel like that's something in itself that if you could have somebody that helps companies nail that would be super helpful. Okay, you guys make decisions about what's best for the customer. You guys make decisions based on what's best for the employee or the team member. Those are two opposing views. So let's find out actually how this is going to move and shake afterwards, right? So that's something in itself that we've just learned by trial by fire, if you will, and kind of going through the motions on that.
Well, it's so difficult. It's like interviewing. Nobody. Well, I mean, maybe you're good at it, but I don't consider myself a good interviewer. I tend to be overly trusting, and I want to believe that everything that a candidate says to me. And there's similar elements of that whenever you're evaluating a culture for an acquisition. And on top of that, you only have access to a very small handful of people. So you don't really get to see, you only see the culture at the various highest levels, which can be totally different in some organizations than the culture that you would experience at the lower levels.
That's exactly right. And, add an extra layer if you're buying companies that are in a different country where just like the general geocultural norms are very different as the approach to work and life and things like that. And that's a part of, being a global organization. But it's just an extra layer. And I think you nailed that. And that's something that is a real challenge that you have to take into account. But even still, even with all of that, I'm still a proponent of, for me at least, I'm still a proponent of M&A. As long as you're not a rocket ship company. If you're a rocket ship company, I think it's probably not worth it. If you're like we're growing 400%, 500% a year, then I think you're probably, unless there's some key reason, why would you deter the rocket ship? But otherwise, good businesses that are growing quickly, they're growing 50% or 80% or whatever, I think it can make a lot of sense.
Well, let's talk a little bit about processes and procedures and overall company, the growth of company sophistication as you grow. One thing that I think about a lot is the unfortunate element that as a company grows, you need to get beyond managing the business in your head, managing the business within spreadsheets, and really start implementing processes and procedures so that if Joe or Sam or Susie or whoever leave the company still operates because it has those roles codified in some form or fashion. On the flip side, though, you start putting processes and procedures in place that has a real potential to start killing off the entrepreneurial spirit. Has your company grown to the point where you're starting to implement those processes and procedures? Have you thought about its impacts on the entrepreneurial spirit within your company or other elements of your culture?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that one. Like, we have implemented a lot of that stuff, and you kind of need it because when you get to a certain size, you can't just get everybody into a room and everybody kind of can easily gut check with each other. You need, for new people being onboarded, to understand how to operate and where things go. And so even though, your initial gut as an entrepreneur, a lot of times is like, wow, that seems like such a big waste of like time and resources. At a certain scale, your company people really need it. They need direction. They need hand-holding on certain things. You're not a tiny group of people. And I would say if you can have, in order to your other part of your question of like, how do you try to keep the, entrepreneurial spirit alive, is I think you can do it within certain bounds. Like, for example, I'm a big fan of, some companies that have implemented things like, I don't know if you ever read like Netflix's like the no rules or otherwise, where they try to take a complex idea and make it simple. And not every company has this luxury, but for example, their expense policy is like spend in Netflix's best interest, right? Which is like super vague. Does that mean if I'm flying to New York and I'm in China, does that mean I can fly first class because I want to be rested? The ticket's $30,000. Like, what does that mean? So you may enter, into a whole bunch of like sticky variables, but it's sort of like if you can implement things like that are certain guidelines and then try to trust that you're hiring some of the right people. It was interesting. I don't know if you saw this, but like Meta had a whole group of people where they had a policy. You could spend money on dinner every night. And people found that through Uber Eats, they would have this credit. And so they would go out to dinner. And if they were going out to dinner with friends or this or that, or they had dinner at home, they would still use this $20 credit. And they would use it in something else. They'd be like, oh, okay, great. I order toothbrushes from Dwayne Reed, or I order, razors, or I order, paper towels from my house. And they were like taking advantage of the policy. And to Meta's credit, even though the policy was unclear, it was like, well, that was not the intent. And we're firing you guys. So we're letting you go because you kind of violated. So if you can take an approach of like trying to be as simple as possible and trying to like ask people to use the right judgment. If they don't, they understand what the consequences are. That's, I think, a good entrepreneurial way to handle it. Then the alternative being, let me hand you a 150-page document you're never going to read that covers every single scenario.
And covers your, what, if they do some arcane thing and that gives the company legal reason to fire them or whatever, which, we don't really care about in the entrepreneurial situation and whatnot. I think the answer, or not the answer, but your answer, what it makes me immediately think of is just coming back to the hiring part of the whole business strategy and whatnot, and how important that is. If you're going to have a policy that depends on the judgment of your employees, then I tell you what, you better hire employees that have they're good at making decisions, I would say.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Well, I don't really have too much else in terms of questions. I certainly would like to give you the opportunity to mention anything about your company that you would like to get out there, or just any topics you feel like I didn't address well enough or go deep enough on.
Maybe like one thing I'll chat about is like the leveling up process. Just like when you keep the wrong person in the role for too long, and then you struggle with adding someone because you're worried about losing them, and you kind of go into this weird back and forth. Well, I need them to do the role. So if I hire somebody above them, when they leave or they see that I'm hiring for that role, I lose them. So, my answer for that is that it's a short-term pain for a long-term gain. Like whatever that person was doing, it's not going to kill your company. It certainly may make things difficult for a month or 2 months or 3, but you're always going to be better off taking a chance at bringing in a better performing person in that role if and when you don't have the right person in that role. So first step should always be, let me try to coach, let me try to grow. But I often find people, even with trying that, can leave people in the wrong role for years. And I've done that too. And you see the pain of that. And then you also see the relief of that when you do make that change. You're like, wow, can you imagine if I'd done this 2 years earlier?
I'm shaking my head because I've definitely been in that situation many times before, kept people or vendors too long when I should have cut ties. And you're right. It's the fear of change, I guess, or the fear of not necessarily hurting their feelings, but, making somebody mad at the organization or whatever. At least that's sometimes part of the motivation or the lack of action on my part. And yeah, once you hire that new person, assuming they are the right person, thought that exact same thing. Man, if we just hired that person 2 years ago, but that's never a good thought process to go down or anything along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, good deal. Well, Zack, really appreciate it. Man, your story is so amazing, just the growth you've been able to achieve. And again, as an M&A guy, I love that M&A was an element to it as opposed to just the rocket ship type company. You've really had to, I'll use your word, evolve many things as you've grown that company, and amazing story. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Great being with you, Nick. This was a lot of fun. Happy to do it anytime. And hopefully we can grab a drink sometime and catch up in person.
Yeah, my only regret really is that I'm not in a position to use your firm. I don't think, because I was like, man, like smart guys like you that really have thought about the strategy. I'm like, man, I want to be in a position to use those guys because they could help me be more successful. So if you think of a way that I could use your firm, then let me know, because I would certainly give it a consideration.
Awesome.
That was my conversation with Zack Dugow, founder and CEO of the ad tech firm The Cool Company, which these days reaches over 2 billion consumers every year and is considered one of the fastest growing companies in North America. Zack's philosophy, you make your money when you buy, not when you sell, is both compelling and visionary. His approach to acquiring companies and seamlessly integrating them to drive growth and efficiency is a masterclass in entrepreneurial problem solving and strategic execution. Through each M&A deal he made to grow his business, Zack has embraced flexibility, adapted his original plans, and navigated the unexpected challenges that came his way, all while driving his business forward. His experience shows that sometimes an enterprise's stratospheric rise is not always contingent upon its own rocket fuel. It's true, there are other ways of going into hyperspace. How about snapping up other successful companies and their corporate culture, for one? That's how Zack and the Cool Company are doing it. Where are you at in your startup journey? Would Zack's hack work for your business? If you were inspired by this episode of Ambition, please share it with a friend or colleague. Thanks for listening.